My daughter sat at that table, watching her cousins tear open gift after gift, boxers, bows, wrapping paper everywhere. And then my mother handed Juni a drugstore bag. No bow, no name tag, just a bag. And when I looked at my 8-year-old's face, she was still smiling. Still grateful. That's when I knew something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. Not with Juni, with all of us. Before I go any further, these stories come from a real place. There's a real person behind this channel. Now, let me take you back to that living room. My name is Tessa Calloway. I am 36 years old. I teach 4th grade at a public school in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, where the hallways smell like dry erase markers and the copy machine jams every Monday without fail. I drive a 2017 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard, a backseat permanently dusted with glitter from a school project Juniper finished in October, and a pine tree air freshener that stopped smelling like pines sometime around February. I am not dramatic. I am not difficult. I have spent the better part of my adult life being neither of those things, and somehow that turned out to be the most dangerous choice I ever made. Juniper Juni. I've called her since she was 3 days old and I saw her face for the first time. Is 8 years old, and she has this way of looking at the world like it owes her absolutely nothing, and she's still grateful for everything. She has her father's dark eyes and my tendency to chew on the inside of her cheek when she's nervous. And she collects smooth river stones and keeps them in a glass jar on her windowsill. She's the most whole person I have ever known. Which is why what happened on Christmas Eve feels less like a family wound and more like a specific, deliberate cut aimed directly at her and meant, I think, to land in me. The house my parents live in is a 4-bedroom colonial in Westerville, 20 minutes from where I rent a 2-bedroom apartment. Gloria keeps it immaculate. There are seasonal wreaths on every door, a nativity scene on the mantle that she brings out the day after Thanksgiving, and a smell of cinnamon and pine that hits you the second you step through the front door. It is the smell of a curated warmth, the kind designed to make you feel like you're entering something sacred. I used to love that smell. I used to drive toward it on holidays and feel something loosen in my chest. That evening, I noticed the scent before I noticed anything else, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it smelled exactly the same, as if nothing had shifted, as if the world inside that house was still the world I thought it was. Beckett and Piper, Adrienne's kids, were already deep into the living room when Juni and I arrived. Beckett is 11, sharp, loud, the kind of boy who narrates everything he does at full volume. Piper is 9, a year older than Juni, and she moves through rooms like she knows she's being watched in a good way. The tree was enormous. My parents get a real one every year, always from the same farm stand on Route 36. And this one was nearly touching the ceiling. Beneath it was a landscape of gifts. I counted later, because I am the kind of person who needed to count 22 wrapped packages in varying sizes, most of them tagged with Beckett's name or Piper's. There were 2 tags with Juni's name. I remember feeling relieved when I saw 2. I told myself that was enough. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. Edmund, my father, was in his armchair with a bourbon and a football game he wasn't really watching. The way he always is at holiday gatherings, present in body, absent in everything that requires a spine. He hugged me when I came in, said I looked tired, told Juni she'd gotten tall. Then he went back to the chair, and that was the full extent of his participation in the evening. Gloria was in the kitchen, directing everything with the cheerful efficiency of someone who has decided that if she stays busy enough, no one will ask her hard questions. She kissed my cheek. She smelled like the candles she burns, amber and vanilla. Expensive. She told Juni her sweater was pretty. Juni beamed. The gifts were opened after dinner. Adrienne orchestrated it the way she orchestrates most things, with a running commentary. A phone out for photos, and an attention to theatrical pacing that would have impressed a producer. Beckett got a gaming console, a new bicycle, 3 games, still in their cases, with a collective retail value I estimated, again, later, because I counted it somewhere close to $900. Piper got a tablet, a jewelry-making kit, 2 American Girl accessories, and a coat with a faux fur hood that retailed for $140. Gloria beamed at each unwrapping. Edmund nodded from his chair. Adrienne narrated every reaction for her Instagram stories. The phone tilted at that specific angle people use when they want to look casual, but are absolutely not being casual. Then Gloria reached behind the tree and produced a small plastic bag, the kind with the pharmacy logo printed on the side in red and white. No tissue paper, no book, no gift tag with Juni's name. She held it out and said, "Cheerfully, Juni, sweetheart, this one's for you." And Juni, my daughter, my 8-year-old who collects riverstones and still believes family is another word for love. Juni reached out and took it with both hands and said, "Thank you, Grandma." Inside were a coloring book and a travel-size hand lotion. Combined value, less than $9. I know because I looked them up in the car afterward, sitting in my parents' driveway in the dark. While Juni fell asleep in the back seat and the pine tree air freshener moved in the heat from the vents, $9.47. That was what my daughter was worth in that room. And the most devastating part, the part I have not stopped thinking about since, was that she had smiled. She had said thank you. She had not known to expect anything different. I went to the bathroom before we left. I ran the cold water so no one would hear me. And I looked at myself in the mirror above my mother's guest sink, the one with the decorative soaps she never lets anyone use, and I thought, this is the last time. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I didn't know yet what it was going to cost me. But I knew, with the kind of cold clarity that only comes when you finally stopped explaining something away, that what happened that night had a name. And that name was not an accident. And somewhere in that house, behind the cinnamon smell and the Christmas carols still playing from the kitchen speaker, my mother already knew it too. Where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. You are not alone in this. People always assume divorce is the loudest thing that ever happens to you. They picture screaming, slammed doors, lawyers in gray suits sitting across mahogany tables. What they don't picture is the silence afterward, the specific hollow quiet of a Tuesday morning when you're making lunches for one small person, and you realize that the absence in the room no longer hurts the way it used to, that the hurt has just become the floor you walk on. Marcus and I separated 3 years before that Christmas. There was no dramatic catalyst, no affair, no explosion, no single night that cracked everything open. There was just a slow, incremental withdrawal. The way a tide pulls back so gradually, you don't notice the shore is exposed until you're standing on wet sand with nowhere to go. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even particularly unkind. He was simply someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the life we were building together was not the life he wanted, and who lacked the courage to say so until Juni was 5 years old and I had already stopped asking. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday. I taught school the next morning. I didn't tell my parents for 2 weeks. That detail matters. I didn't tell my parents for 2 weeks, not because I was ashamed, but because I already knew, on some level, I hadn't yet named what their response would be. Gloria would make it about Adrienne. She would reference, with that particular tone she uses, gentle, concerned, devastating, how Adrienne had handled her own difficult period with such grace, how Adrienne had leaned on the family, how Adrienne had let people in. And I would sit across from her at that kitchen table and nod, and something inside me would go very quiet and very still, the way it always did when I was being compared to my sister and found lacking without a single accusation being made directly. Adrienne is 3 years older than me, and she has always been the architecture of our family, the thing everyone else is built around. She is organized in a way that reads as virtue. Her house is clean in a way that gets commented on. Her children are enrolled in the right activities, photographed in coordinated outfits, and displayed on Gloria's refrigerator in 4 separate photos, while Juni's school picture, the one where she's missing a front tooth and grinning like the world, is a tremendous joke she's in on, occupies a single small frame on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. I noticed that years ago. I filed it away. I kept filing things away, year after year, building a cabinet in the back of my mind that I never opened because opening it would have required me to say out loud what I already knew. My salary as a public school teacher in Ohio is $41,000 a year before taxes. After rent, utilities, Juni's after-school program, groceries, and the minimum payment on the credit card I used when the Civic needed a new alternator in September, I have approximately $230 left at the end of each month. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you this because it is the material reality inside which I make every decision, including the decision every holiday season not to ask my parents for help, not to say, we are stretched thin, not to say Juni's winter coat is from the thrift store on Henderson Road and it's a size too big because I bought it that way so she could wear it again next year. I didn't say those things because saying them felt like losing, like admitting I had failed at something Adrienne had managed to get right. What I understand now, and what took me an embarrassingly long time to understand, is that my silence was not strength. It was accommodation. I had spent so many years making myself small and easy and uncomplicated that my family had simply stopped accounting for me in any real way. When you never ask for anything, people stop considering what you might need, and eventually they stop seeing you as someone who needs things at all. You become a fixed piece of furniture in the family landscape, reliable, undemanding, easy to overlook. I had built that invisibility myself, one quiet swallowed complaint at a time, and I had called it being low maintenance. The Christmas before the bag, Juni had asked me why Grandma always bought Piper the big presents. She was 7. She asked it the way 7-year-olds ask things without accusation, without bitterness, just pure unfiltered observation. The way children notice the things adults have agreed to stop seeing. I told her that different families do things differently. I told her that what mattered was that we loved each other. I told her Grandma loved her very much. I said all the things you say when you are protecting a child from a truth you haven't fully admitted to yourself. Juni nodded. She went back to her Riverstones. And I sat on the edge of her bed after she fell asleep, and I thought, I am lying to my daughter to protect the people who are hurting her. I thought it clearly, and then I went to bed, and I got up the next morning, and I made lunches, and I drove to school, and I did not do a single thing about it. That is the year I need you to understand before we get to the year of the bag, the year I already knew, the year I chose one more time to look away. Because what happened on that Christmas Eve didn't come from nowhere. It came from a decade of small surrenders, each one so minor it barely registered a seating arrangement, a photo on a fridge, a birthday call that came 2 days late, a question never asked. It came from a family that had learned, because I had taught them that Tessa could be handled with the minimum and would not complain. They weren't wrong. I had made myself into someone who could be handled that way. The night of the drugstore bag was not the beginning. It was just the first time the truth was so visible, so undisguised, so casually delivered in a plastic pharmacy bag with no bow and no name tag that I could no longer file it away. The cabinet in the back of my mind had finally run out of room. And somewhere in the drive home, with Juni asleep in the back seat and $9.47 sitting in a plastic bag on the floor behind my seat, the door swung open on its own, and everything I had been storing in there for years came pouring out all at once into the dark. I called my mother 3 days after Christmas. I had rehearsed it. I had actually stood in my kitchen on the morning of December 28th, drinking coffee that had gone cold, and rehearsed what I was going to say the way I used to rehearse parent-teacher conferences when I was a first-year teacher, and still believed that the right words, arranged in the right order, could prevent a difficult conversation from becoming a damaging one. I was calm. I was measured. I was not going to cry. I was going to say, "Mom, I need to talk to you about what happened on Christmas Eve, and I need you to actually hear me." She picked up on the second ring. Gloria always picks up on the second ring, never the first, because she believes answering immediately seems desperate, and never the third, because she was raised to believe that keeping people waiting is a form of rudeness. Second ring. Every time. I have called that number my entire life, and she has always, without exception, picked up on the second ring. And for some reason, that detail hit me harder than anything else in that moment. The sheer, unchanged reliability of her, the way she remained so completely herself while I had spent years reshaping myself around her edges. I told her about the bag. I was careful. I said, I noticed a significant difference between what Juni received and what Beckett and Piper received, and I want to understand it. I did not say, "You humiliated my daughter." I did not say, $9. I did not say. She sat at that table and smiled because she didn't know she was allowed to expect more. I kept my voice even. I used the language I use with parents at school when I have to deliver news they don't want to hear. Neutral, clear, non-accusatory. I gave her every possible opening to meet me with grace. There was a pause. The kind of pause that isn't confusion, it's calculation. I know the difference now, though it took me longer than it should have. Then Gloria said, in that voice, the warm one, the gentle one, the one that coats every devastating thing she says in a layer of sweetness so thick it takes you a full 24 hours to feel the damage. "Tessa, honey, you never tell us what Juni needs. If we don't know, we can't help. You should be more like Adrienne. She sends me a list in November." I stood in my kitchen, and I felt something happen in my body that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like a structural shift, the sensation of a load-bearing wall quietly giving way. She had done it so cleanly. In 2 sentences. She had taken the fact of Juni sitting at that table with the drugstore bag while her cousins unwrapped $900 worth of presents. And she had made it my fault. My failure to communicate. My failure to be like Adrienne. The problem wasn't the bag. The problem was me. I said, "Mom, Adrienne shouldn't need to send a list for Juni to receive a real gift. She is 8 years old. She is your granddaughter." Gloria made a small sound, sympathetic, almost, and said that she didn't appreciate my tone. That she and my father did their best. That the holidays were stressful and she couldn't be expected to read minds. And then she said something that I have turned over so many times since that the edges of it have gone smooth. "You've always made things harder than they need to be, Tessa. Ever since you were little, calm, warm, delivered like an observation about the weather." I ended the call. I set my phone face down on the counter, and I stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at nothing. The apartment was quiet. Juni was at a friend's house, which was the only reason I had chosen that morning to call. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside, and I thought about being little. I thought about being the easy one, the quiet one, the one who didn't make things harder than they needed to be. I thought about how long I had worn that as an identity, as a point of pride almost. Look how little space I take up. Look how uncomplicated I am. And I thought about my daughter smiling at a drugstore bag with both hands because she had been raised by someone who had never taught her she was allowed to want more. Within 48 hours, the family group chat had 17 new messages. I know because I counted them before I turned my notifications off. Adrienne had spoken to Gloria. Edmund had weighed in 3 lines, which was more than he'd said to me at Christmas dinner, to say that he hoped I would reflect on how my words had affected my mother, who had worked very hard to make the holiday special for everyone. Adrienne's message was longer. It was measured in the way that only truly sharp things are measured. Each sentence precise, each word chosen. She said I had blindsided Gloria, that I had made an uncomfortable situation out of nothing, that if I had concerns, I should have raised them privately. I had raised them privately. That was the call. That was the kitchen. That was the private conversation that was now, apparently, a group discussion. I read every message once. I set my phone down, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I did not draft a response. I did not search for the right words. I did not try to explain myself in a way that would make everyone comfortable again. I just sat with what had happened. The call, the bag, the group chat, the 17 messages, and I let myself feel the full, unmediated weight of it without rushing to make it smaller. It was heavy, it was clarifying. And somewhere in that stillness, a thought arrived that had never arrived before. Quiet and absolute as a door closing. I am not the problem. I have never been the problem. And I am done pretending otherwise. Have you ever been in a room or a group chat where you realized your family had chosen a side, and it wasn't yours? Tell me in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one. The group chat went quiet after 2 days. That particular silence, the kind that follows a family argument that no one wants to officially declare a family argument, has its own specific texture. It is not peace. It is everyone retreating to their corners and waiting to see who will blink first. I had blinked first my entire life. I was the one who sent the follow-up text. The one who called to smooth things over. The one who showed up at the next family dinner with a dish I had cooked and a smile I had rehearsed and an unspoken agreement with myself to let whatever had happened simply dissolve back into the surface of things, the way it always had. I did not blink this time. I put my phone in a kitchen drawer and I left it there for 3 days. On the 4th day, Adrienne called me directly. I almost didn't answer. I stood in my living room and watched her name on the screen, threw 2 full rings, and then I picked up, because some habits are older than your best intentions. Her voice was the voice she uses when she has decided to be the reasonable one, measured. Slightly tired, generous in a way that costs her nothing. She said she was calling because she was worried about me. She said the holidays were hard for everyone, and she understood I was going through a lot. She said she hoped I knew that Mom and Dad loved Juni very much. She said all of this without once acknowledging the bag, the $9, the 22 gifts under the tree, or the phone call in the kitchen. It was a masterpiece of concerned erasure. I asked her directly, Adrienne, do you think what Juni received was fair? There was a pause. Shorter than glorious, less calculated, more reflexive. Then she said, I think you're making Juni a part of something she doesn't need to be a part of. And there it was. The reframe. The pivot. Suddenly, the issue was not what had been done to my daughter. The issue was what I was doing to my daughter by noticing what had been done to her. I had seen this move before, I had just never had a name for it until that moment. Standing in my living room with the phone pressed to my ear and a very clear, very cold understanding settling in my chest like ice water finding its level. I told Adrienne I needed to go. I hung up. 20 minutes later, Edmund called. My father, who had not initiated a phone call to me and I had to think about it, possibly 2 years, called me on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of January to tell me, in a voice that suggested Gloria was in the room, that I owed my mother an apology. He said she had cried. He said the holidays were supposed to be a time for family. He said he hoped I would think about what kind of example I was setting for Juniper. He said all of this in the tone of a man reading from a script he didn't write and wasn't sure he believed. And when he finished, there was a silence that I think surprised both of us. I did not fill it. I said, I'll think about what you've said, Dad, and I hung up. By the end of that week, the narrative had been set. I knew it had been set because of the way Adrienne's message in the group chat had shifted from the original thread, the one about my call to Gloria, to a new, adjacent story. In this story, Tessa was going through a hard time. Tessa had always struggled with the holidays since the divorce. Tessa had lashed out at Mom, who only wanted to bring the family together. The bag was never mentioned. Juni was never mentioned. The disparity $1,900 against $9.47 was never mentioned. What was mentioned, repeatedly and from multiple angles, was my tone. My attitude. My failure to be grateful for what my parents provided. It was elegant, in a terrible way. They had taken a story about what was done to my daughter and replaced it entirely with a story about my behavior. I want to be precise about what this felt like, because I think it matters. It did not feel like betrayal. Not exactly. Betrayal implies surprise, and I was not surprised. It felt more like recognition. Like finally seeing, in full light, a shape that had always been there in the dark. My family had a story about me, Tessa, the difficult one, the one who makes things harder than they need to be, the one who never tells us what she needs and then resents us for not knowing. And they were not willing to release that story because releasing it would require them to examine their own. So they tightened their grip on it instead. They made it louder. They recruited Edmund, who was already compliant, and Adrienne, who had her own reasons to keep the hierarchy intact. And they left me standing outside a circle I had never fully been inside to begin with. What they miscalculated was this. I was no longer trying to get back in. I had spent 36 years managing their comfort, softening my edges, filing things away, swallowing the things that needed to be said so that family dinners could end without incident. I had a cabinet full of evidence, years of it, every small dismissal and loaded comparison and gift that said plainly what no one would say out loud, and the cabinet was open now. I was not going to close it again. I was going to go through every single item inside it, carefully. The way you go through evidence when you are finally ready to understand what it proves. I didn't know yet that I wasn't the only one who had been keeping records. I didn't know that someone else had been watching this family for years from a distance, with a clarity I had never been able to access from the inside. I didn't know about Celeste yet. I didn't know what she was holding or how long she had been waiting for someone to finally ask. But she had seen the group chat, and 3 days after Edmund's phone call, she sent me a message I almost deleted without reading, a single line from a number I didn't immediately recognize. Tessa, I've been watching this happen since before you were born. Call me when you're ready. I have things you need to see. I almost deleted it. That is the honest truth. The number wasn't saved in my phone. The message was 6 lines long. And I was in a season of my life where anything that required emotional energy felt like a bill I couldn't afford to pay. I read it twice, standing in the school parking lot after dismissal, with the January wind coming sideways across the asphalt and a stack of ungraded papers on the passenger seat beside me. I read it a third time. Then I saved the number under Celeste Cousin, and I sat in the Civic for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Celeste Varden is my mother's first cousin's daughter, which makes her something like a second cousin to me, which in our family meant she existed at the outer edge of the holiday orbit, present at major gatherings every few years. Spoken of warmly in the abstract, never fully integrated into the inner circle. She is 51 years old. She lives in Pittsburgh. She left her family's particular gravitational pull sometime in her late 20s and had, from what I understood, maintained a careful and deliberate distance ever since. I had not spoken to her in years. I had not thought about her in longer than that, but she had been watching. That was the thing I kept returning to as I finally started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. She had been watching this whole time. I called her that evening after Juni was in bed. I sat on the bathroom floor, the same place I go when I need to cry without being heard. The same place I had gone after the bag, and I called her with the door closed and the fan on and my back against the cold side of the tub. She picked up immediately. No second ring calculation, just her voice, direct and unhurried, as if she had been sitting with the phone in her hand waiting for exactly this. She said, "I'm glad you called. I wasn't sure you would." I said, "Tell me what you have." She said, "I want you to understand first that what I'm going to show you isn't going to feel good." I said I was past the point of needing it to feel good. She said, "Good, then we can talk." What Celeste had was not a single thing. It was an accumulation, the same kind of accumulation I had been building in the back of my own mind, except hers was external, documented, and dated. She had photographs going back 20 years. She had a letter Gloria had written to her own mother, Celeste's grandmother, a woman named Ruth who had died in 2019, in which Gloria described Tessa as the child who requires the least, meaning she can be managed with the minimum. She had written that in a letter. In 2003, when I was 13 years old, Celeste had found it in Ruth's things after the funeral and had kept it because she recognized, even then, that it was the kind of document that tells you everything about a person in a single sentence. She also had records of money, not formal financial documents. She was clear about that, but the kind of accumulated observation that comes from paying attention at family gatherings for decades, birthday envelopes counted and compared, holiday gifts noted, a college graduation gift given to Adrienne that Celeste had witnessed personally, a check for $8,000 that was presented at a family dinner Tessa had not been invited to, because she had already moved out of state for her teaching program, and Gloria had decided the dinner was too small to warrant the trip. Celeste had been at that dinner. She had asked Gloria afterward whether Tessa would be receiving something comparable. Gloria had smiled and said, "Tessa is very independent. She doesn't need it the way Adrienne does." I wrote everything down as Celeste talked. I had a legal pad on my knee, the same kind I use for lesson planning, and I wrote in the same careful, even handwriting I use when I'm taking notes. I intend to keep date, amount, context, source. Celeste talked for 40 minutes. When she finished, I looked down at the legal pad and I had filled 3 pages. 3 pages of things I had either witnessed myself and minimized, or never known at all. That together formed a pattern so consistent and so long-standing that calling it oversight, calling it anything other than deliberate, was no longer something I was willing to do. This was not a family that sometimes got things slightly uneven. This was a family that had made a choice, repeatedly and over decades, about which children mattered and which ones could be managed with a minimum. I asked Celeste why she had kept all of it. There was a pause. Not Gloria's calculating pause, not Adrienne's reflexive one. This was the pause of someone choosing their words because they mean them. She said, "Because I grew up watching Ruth do the same thing to my mother. And I told myself that if I ever saw it happening to someone else in this family, I was going to be the person who said something. I just didn't know if you were ready to hear it." I thought about the year I had sat on the edge of Juni's bed after she asked about the presents. I thought about every time I had filed something away. I said, "I should have been ready a long time ago." She said, "You're ready now. That's what matters." Before we hung up, Celeste said one more thing. She said she would send me everything she had, scans of the letter, the photographs, the notes she had kept over the years, and that I could do whatever I wanted with it. She said she wasn't telling me what my decision should be. She said that was entirely mine to make. But she also said, Tessa, a pattern this long and this consistent doesn't happen by accident, and you are not the difficult one. You have never been the difficult one. You were just the one they knew would never make them pay for it. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after the call ended. The fan was still running. The apartment was completely quiet. And somewhere in the silence, something that had been bent for a very long time began, slowly and almost painfully, to straighten. Celeste's files arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was eating breakfast before school. I heard my phone buzz on the counter, and when I picked it up, there were 11 attachment scans. Screenshots, a photo of a handwritten letter in my mother's looped cursive that I recognized immediately. The way you recognize a parent's handwriting, even when you wish you didn't. I looked at them for 60 seconds. Then I put my phone face down and I finished my breakfast. I dropped Juni at school. I drove to work. I taught fractions to 22 fourth graders with the particular focused calm of someone who has decided that falling apart is a luxury she cannot afford on a Tuesday. And then I came home, I made dinner, I put Juni to bed, and I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, Celeste's files, and a legal pad, and I started building something I was going to make impossible to ignore. I want to explain what documentation actually looks like when you are not a lawyer, not a journalist, not someone with resources or institutional backing, just a public school teacher at a kitchen table with a cracked laptop and a determination she has nowhere else to put. It looks like spreadsheets. It looks like screenshots taken methodically, one by one, and saved into a folder you label with a date. It looks like writing down what you remember, not dramatically, not with commentary. Just the facts, the dates, the amounts, the words said and by whom and in what context. With the same neutral precision you use when you're documenting a student's behavioral pattern for a school report. You remove the emotion from the recording even though the emotion is everywhere. You make it clean. You make it legible. You make it the kind of thing that cannot be dismissed as sensitivity or misremembering. I started with money because money leaves the clearest trail. Adrienne's college graduation check, $8,000, April 2009. Confirmed by Celeste, who was present. My college graduation, a card with a $50 bill, June 2011, which I remembered clearly because I had kept the card in a box for years under the vague impression that keeping it meant something. I had never compared the two figures out loud before. I had known them both individually and kept them in separate compartments of my mind. Placing them side by side in a spreadsheet column, with dates and a source column and a notes column, was one of the quieter, devastating experiences of that entire period. $50, $8,000. Same family, same milestone, different daughters. I kept going. Birthday envelopes, I had a memory for figures, always had. An occupational habit from years of managing a classroom budget down to the last ream of copy paper. Gloria's birthday envelopes to me had run, consistently, between $20 and $40 for as far back as I could remember. I cross-referenced with what Celeste had observed going to Adrienne over the years, and with what I had personally witnessed being handed to Beckett and Piper at their own birthdays when I was present. The pattern held without exception across more than 15 years of data points. It was not random variation. Random variation does not produce a consistent differential in the same direction, to the same people, across 15 years without a single outlier. Then, I moved to the non-financial record. Gloria's letter to Ruth, the one that called me the child who requires the least, the one that said I could be managed with the minimum. I scanned it again, slowly. I looked at the date, March 2003. I was 13. I tried to remember being 13, tried to remember if I had known, at 13, that my mother had already categorized me this way, already filed me under manageable, already assigned me a budget of the minimum. I didn't remember knowing. I remembered trying very hard to be good. I remembered thinking that if I was easy enough, helpful enough, quiet enough, I would eventually earn something I could not have named then, but could name now. The ordinary, unremarkable experience of being seen as enough. I documented the Christmas Eve in the same format. Date, December 24th. Location, parents' house, Westerville. Gifts to Beckett, itemized list, estimated retail values, total approximately $940. Gifts to Piper, itemized list, estimated retail values, total approximately $960. Combined total to Adrienne's children, $1,900, conservatively. Gifts to Juniper Calloway, 1 coloring book, 1 travel size hand lotion, purchased in a pharmacy bag with no gift wrap, no bow, no name tag. Retail value confirmed via online search, $9.47. I typed that figure into the spreadsheet and I looked at it for a long time. $9.47. In a column next to $1,900, on the same Christmas Eve, in the same living room. For children who shared the same grandparents, I also documented the aftermath. The kitchen call, date, duration, exact phrases I could recall verbatim, including, "You never tell us what Juni needs, and you should be more like Adrienne, and you've always made things harder than they need to be." The group chat, screenshots, timestamps, names of participants, content of each message. Edmund's phone call, date, duration, the instruction to apologize to my mother who had cried. Adrienne's call, date, the reframe, the pivot, the sentence about making Juni part of something she didn't need to be part of. Each item went into the record. Each item had a date and a source and, where available, a screenshot or a scan. By the time I finished, it was past midnight, and my coffee had gone cold twice, and I had 7 pages of notes and a spreadsheet with 43 rows. I saved everything to a cloud folder. I saved a backup on a USB drive that I put in the zippered pocket of my work bag. And then I sat back and I looked at what I had built. Not a story, not a grievance, not a version of events filtered through feeling, but a record. 43 data points across more than 20 years, all pointing in the same direction, all saying the same thing in the language of dates and dollar amounts and documented words. I had been the manageable one, the minimum one, the one who required the least and could therefore be given the least, year after year, Christmas after Christmas, birthday after birthday, because she would not make it harder than it needed to be. I had the proof now, clean, organized, dated, sourced, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. I did not send the spreadsheet to anyone. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect a story like this to build toward a confrontation, a dramatic reveal, a printed document slapped on a holiday table, a moment where the evidence is presented and the guilty parties are forced to reckon with what they've done. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and colder, and in some ways more final than any argument could have been. I had spent 6 weeks building the record, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, something I needed to look into long enough and clearly enough that I could no longer look away. By the time I finished, I didn't need to show it to anyone. I already knew what it meant, and I already knew what I was going to do. The decision arrived the way the most important decisions do, not as a dramatic resolution, but as a simple, declarative fact that had apparently been true for some time before I caught up to it. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in late January, and Juni was at the counter eating cereal and reading one of her library books. And the winter light was coming through the window at that particular low angle it gets in Ohio in January. And I watched my daughter turn a page and reach absently for her spoon without looking up from the book. And I thought, she deserves a life in which she is never in that room again. Not that house. Not that table. Not that particular arrangement of people who had demonstrated, consistently and across decades, that she was worth the minimum. She deserved a life where the baseline was not managed with the minimum. And the only person who could give her that life was me. I drafted the message to Gloria over 3 days. Not because I was uncertain about what I wanted to say, but because I wanted every word to be exact. I was not going to be angry in it. I was not going to be wounded. I was not going to give her the version of Tessa she expected, the one who eventually softens, apologizes, absorbs, moves on. I was going to be precise. I wrote it the way I write parent communications at school when a situation has moved beyond informal resolution, factual, documented, professional, final. I said that I had reflected carefully on the events of Christmas Eve and the conversations that followed. I said that I had documented a pattern of differential treatment between myself and my daughter on one side and Adrienne and her children on the other, and that this pattern was consistent across more than 20 years of observable data. I did not attach the spreadsheet. I did not need to. I knew what I had. She knew what she'd done. I told her that I was not writing to argue or to extract an apology. I said that I had reached the conclusion that the environment her household created was not one in which Juniper could be present without being harmed, not dramatically, not obviously, but in the slow, cumulative way that teaches a child what she is worth by showing her, year after year, how little she is given. I told her that Juni would not be attending family gatherings at their home going forward, and that I would not be attending either. I said this was not a punishment and not a negotiation. It was a decision I had made after careful consideration of the available evidence, and it was not subject to revision based on responses that did not include a direct, specific, unambiguous acknowledgement of what had happened and why it was wrong. I told her I loved her. I meant it. I sent it on a Wednesday evening, and then I put my phone in the kitchen drawer and I went and sat with Juni while she watched her show, and I did not check for a response until the following morning. Gloria responded within 2 hours. I know this because the timestamp was on the message when I read it. She had written 4 paragraphs. The first expressed hurt. The second expressed confusion. She could not understand where this was coming from. She had always tried her best. The holidays were complicated. The third expressed concern for my mental health in language gentle enough to be deniable. The fourth said she hoped I would reconsider for Juniper's sake, because children needed their extended family, and that she and Edmund would be there when I was ready to talk. There was no acknowledgement of the bag. No acknowledgement of $1,900 against $9.47. No acknowledgement of the letter to Ruth, or the graduation check, or the 20 years of spreadsheet data I had not sent, but could have. Not one sentence that said, I see what I did. I understand why it was wrong. I am sorry. Adrienne messaged me the following day. Hers was shorter, 3 sentences. She said Gloria was devastated. She said I was tearing the family apart over a gift bag. She said she hoped I would think about what I was teaching Juni about how to handle conflict. I read it once. I did not respond. Edmund did not message me at all, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing he had done in years. His silence was at least accurate. He had never been present in any way that mattered, and he was not going to start now. I filed all 3 responses, Gloria's, Adrienne's, Edmund's non-response, into the cloud folder with the spreadsheet and the letter and the screenshots. Not because I needed more evidence. Because I wanted a complete record of not just what they had done, but what they had chosen to do when given a direct and unambiguous opportunity to do otherwise. I called Celeste that evening. I told her what I had sent and what I had received. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I feel like I set something down that I have been carrying for a very long time." She said that was exactly right. She said she was proud of me, and the word landed differently than I expected. Not patronizing, not performed. It landed like something true, said by someone who had watched from a distance long enough to know what it had cost. I thanked her for the files. I thanked her for the phone call in January that I had almost not returned. She said, "You would have gotten here on your own. I just gave you the map. What would you have done? If you had built that spreadsheet, if you had 43 data points across 20 years, would you have stayed? Would you have tried one more time? Or would you have sent the message and closed the drawer? Tell me in the comments. I need to hear from you on this one." The first holiday without them was a Thursday. Thanksgiving, 8 months after the message to Gloria, I had bought a small turkey breast, the kind you roast in a single pan. No ceremony required, and Juni had asked if she could make the mashed potatoes herself. Which meant I stood beside her at the stove for 40 minutes while she stirred with great seriousness and tasted approximately 11 times to confirm they were still good. We ate at our kitchen table with the overhead light on and a candle Juni had picked from the dollar section at Target. Orange, shaped vaguely like a leaf, slightly crooked. She put it in the center of the table and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has arranged something exactly right. I watched her do that and I felt something I had not felt at a holiday table in longer than I could honestly remember. I felt like I was in the right place. Gloria had called twice in the months between my message and Thanksgiving. I had let both calls go to voicemail. The first message said she missed me and hoped we could talk soon. The second said she had been thinking a lot and wanted the chance to explain some things, and that she loved Juni and hoped Juni knew that. I listened to both messages once, standing in the school parking lot in the same wind that had been blowing when I read Celeste's text in January, and I noticed something in myself I hadn't expected. Not anger, not grief. Not the old familiar pull toward reconciliation that had governed my behavior for 36 years. Just a clear, steady stillness. The stillness of someone who has already made the decision and does not need to make it again. I did not call back. I did not respond to the voicemails. I understood that this would be interpreted by Gloria and by Adrienne and by Edmund in his silent armchair as cruelty, as the dramatic overreaction of a difficult woman who had always made things harder than they needed to be. I had spent a long time caring about that interpretation. I had shaped my entire adult life around managing it, softening it, preempting it. I did not care about it anymore. Not because I had become hard, but because I had finally understood that other people's interpretations of my boundaries were not my responsibility to manage. That was a new thought. It saddened me strangely at first, the way new thoughts do, slightly uncomfortable, slightly too large for the space it was occupying. And then, gradually, it fit. Juni asked me once, in early spring, whether we were going to see Grandma again. We were in the car, coming home from her school, and she asked it the way she asks most things directly, without preamble. The question just arriving fully formed from wherever she keeps them. I had thought about how I would answer this question. I had rehearsed versions of it the way I had once rehearsed the call to Gloria. Except this time, the rehearsal was not about managing anyone's comfort. It was about telling the truth to an 8-year-old in a way she could carry without being damaged by it. I said, "I don't know yet. Juni," I said, "what I do know is that you and I are going to spend our holidays exactly the way we want to spend them, with people who make us feel good." She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "Like Celeste?" I said, "Yes, exactly like Celeste. Celeste came for Christmas." She drove from Pittsburgh on the 23rd and stayed in the second bedroom, which meant Juni spent 48 hours showing her every item of significance in the apartment. The Riverstones, the library books, the slightly crooked leaf candle she had saved from Thanksgiving because she decided it was too good to burn all the way down. Celeste examined each thing with the patient attention of someone who understood that being shown a child's treasures is a serious privilege. She brought gifts wrapped in actual paper with actual bows and a tag that said Juni's full name, Juniper Wren Calloway, in handwriting that looped generously across the front. Juni unwrapped them slowly, the way children do when they want to make something last. I watched her face. It was the face of a child who expected good things and was receiving them. I had not seen that face at Christmas before. It undid me, quietly, in the best possible way. We did not have a tree that year. We had a string of lights Juni and I had wound around the bookshelf in the living room, and a handful of ornaments she had made at school hung on a small branch I had found in the yard and put in a mason jar. It was not the nativity scene on the mantle. It was not the enormous real tree from the farm stand on Route 36, or the curated cinnamon warmth of my mother's house. It was a branch in a mason jar with paper ornaments and dollar store lights, and it was the most honest Christmas I had ever had, because every single thing in that room had been chosen by people who actually wanted to be there. There is a version of this story where I find a way back, where Gloria calls the third time and says the right words, and I drive to Westerville and we sit at the kitchen table and something real gets repaired. I have thought about that version. I have held it up and looked at it carefully. The way you look at something you're trying to decide whether to keep, and what I keep returning to is this. Repair requires acknowledgement. It requires the person who caused the harm to see the harm clearly and say so without qualification. Gloria's voicemails did not do that. Adrienne's 3 sentences did not do that. Edmund's silence certainly did not do that. I cannot build a bridge from my side all the way to theirs and then stand on it alone and call it reconciliation. I have tried that. It is just falling. Done slowly. What I have instead is a kitchen table. A slightly crooked candle. A child who makes mashed potatoes with great seriousness and saves ornaments because she decides they're too good to use up all at once. I have Celeste, who drove for hours in December traffic because she wanted to be in the room where Juni opened her presents. I have a cloud folder I have not opened in months because I no longer need to look at it, not because the contents aren't true, but because the decision has already been made and the evidence has already done its work. I have a spreadsheet with 43 rows that I hope I never need to show anyone, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I built it, that I finally built it, because my daughter sat at a table and smiled at a drugstore bag, and I decided she would never have to do that again. Juni put one of her river stones on the kitchen windowsill last week. A smooth gray one, almost perfectly oval, that she found at the park near our apartment. She held it out to show me and said, "Look, Mama, this one's a good one." I held it in my palm. It was cool and solid and without edges. I said, "You're right, Juni, this one's a good one." She put it on the sill next to the others, adjusted it twice until it was exactly where she wanted it, and then went back to her book. And I stood at that window for a long time, looking at a row of stones collected by a child who still believes the world is full of good things worth keeping. And I thought, that belief is intact. After everything, that belief is still intact. I did not break it. I protected it. That is the only thing I needed to get right. And I got it right. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything.